Okay, so I won GMTK 2024. Oh my god, we did it! So me and my friend won GMTK Game Jam 2024, and it was insane. It wasn't easy, the experience wasn't smooth, the development took crazy twists and turns, and you have no idea what had to happen for this game to exist. I'll tell you everything. First, some context. Game Jam is an event when people make video games from scratch in a limited time following a specific theme. It's like a sandcastle contest with video games instead of sandcastles. The theme is only revealed when Jam starts for two reasons. First, since most game jams are held online, it's to prevent people from developing their games ahead of time. And second, it's fun to have a theme. Limitations breed creativity. GMTK Game Jam is an annual event held by the author of GMTK YouTube channel, and it's one of the biggest game jams in the world, with thousands of games submitted every year. Now, I have participated GMTK in the past, with whatever results. However, this time was different. First, we had twice as much time, 96 hours instead of 48. 4 full days. Except with my job schedule, I probably can't have 4 days off in a row whenever I want, but still. And second, I had twice as much people in my team. Last times I participated alone, with some occasional help from my friends. This time I had a friend who was willing to commit to this 4-day madness with me. An absolute awesome person, Zahar, also known as Grois. So, I have a team, and with some experience of previous jams, we have a plan. Two main problems I had on game jams so far are trying to make a game too big and not finishing it in time. It's always better to make a small game well polished than a big unfinished project. If your game has bugs or bad difficulty balance or no tutorial, you just give players no chance to appreciate your game, no matter how good the idea is. And second is having a bad idea to start with, or rather coming up with a better idea after or during the jam and regretting the idea you already committed to. To defeat these two problems, the plan. The jam starts at 8 PM our local time, and for entire day 0 and 1 I'm busy. As I said, job schedule is not perfect and I can't do anything these days, but I can look at the theme and start making up ideas while I'm at work. So entire day 0 and day 1 is dedicated to brainstorming and picking the idea. Hopefully this way we will not regret the idea, right? On day 2 we have to make a game, and that's it. We have 1 day to do it. First reason for that is that polishing a game takes a lot of time. Once you have a game with all the mechanics, levels and content you want for it, you still need to test, fix and balance it a lot. So it's actually reasonable to finish first version of the game early and then update it. The second reason is that having this requirement in the first place limits the scope of a game that we aim for and helps us pick a smaller and better idea. And days 3 and 4 are dedicated to polish. That's the plan at least. Let's see how it went. The theme is
built to scale.
we started making ideas and we started sharing ideas. We made a mirror board for that, and it was a new experience for me, because your teammate takes a fresh look at the idea so they can change it and make it better. If you work alone and you have a bad idea, it just remains bad. But in a team, we shared even ideas which we didn't like, because it always has a chance to evolve into something good. For example, I had an idea about shadows, because shadow is a natural and obvious way to represent scale, but I didn't know what the gameplay should be. The best I came up with was a shadow theater game, where you move 3D objects and make a shadow look like a target picture. I liked the shadow part of this idea, but I didn't like the gameplay. But then Zahar said, let there be a character who moves on the shadows. He still didn't like this idea, but it clicked, because then I said, let there be a player with a shadow that's disconnected from the player, so the shadow and the player can move independently and help each other solve levels in a mix of puzzle platformer and Sokoban game. We both liked this idea, and as you can see, it required both my and Zahar's brains to make it up. So we was sharing and discussing, and at the end of day 1 we had a lot of ideas, from dog breeds to point and click game on a sky map to fractal tower defense, but we had to pick one, and honestly we had a favorite. Without any doubt we selected this idea about a shadow puzzle. One character, but its shadow disconnects from the body. For example, he can move an object on a scene. That will create a shadow on a screen, and he can stand next to an object and jump to the side, and his shadow will jump on the shadow of an object. The goal is to get to the other side of a scene, both boy and his shadow. At the start, objects or shadows prevents it. Did you understand what this game is about? Because apparently we didn't. Last thing we needed to do on day 1 is to define and describe a game. And this is when our workflow started to crumble. I went first and described how I see the game. So it's in 3D, a fixed camera angle, we are in theater with viewers and curtain, and there's a lamp in the back and a screen in the front. So when a player walks in, he creates a shadow, and every object creates a shadow, and the size of the shadow changes correspondingly. But when a player walks past an object, the shadow collides with an object and disconnects. But you still control both simultaneously, and the goal is to solve puzzles in both 3D and 2D and to get to exit together with the shadow. Now that's cool, but Zahar had a different idea. He proposed to split the screen into halves, have a puzzle platformer on top and grid-based Sokoban on bottom, with the top scene being the shadow on the wall of the bottom scene, and have a shadow size to change correspondingly. But the player and the shadow are controlled independently, and you can switch between them with the press of a button. So we have the idea, but we still don't know how the game looks like. That's not good. Now we both agreed that this idea seems more interesting, but then Zahar asked a question. What happens to the size of the shadow if a player moves outside of a beam of light? Now this particular question is not important. We can say it always change, we can say it only changes when the player is in light, it doesn't matter. But this question reveals how fragile this whole idea is. It looks good on paper, but it breaks apart when you discuss mechanics and level design in detail. So we tried to fix this idea. Remember, we're making a jam game, so people will only play it for 10, maybe 15 minutes. I wanted rules to be simple and obvious, so I only really considered two extreme cases. Case 1, full lock. The player and the shadow never disconnects. This way, if a shadow jumps on the box, the player will float in the air, even if there's nothing under it. It's an interesting mechanic, but it limits the player too much. You can't even stand in front or behind the box, because to do that, the shadow have to be inside of the shadow of the box, and it's impossible. They must collide. So this idea just doesn't work. Player can't go anywhere, and it can't push boxes forward or backwards, only left and right. Case 2 is the opposite. As I originally proposed, full disconnect. The shadow disconnects on any collision, and it works, but it gives the player too much freedom. As Zahar noticed, on every level, the player will just leave the shadow in the beginning of the level, and then go ahead and solve the level in 3D, and then when the path is cleared, the shadow will catch up. So the fact that you control the shadow and the player simultaneously just doesn't matter. 90% of the time, the shadow will just bump into something and stand in the beginning of the level, doing nothing. So this idea just regresses to this idea, and everything in between two cases has inobvious rules. Not good for a game jam. There was a way to add holes along with obstacles and a similar object for shadows, so the shadow doesn't collide with it, it just fails the level. But it's a bit too complex and we don't have enough time to level design with this amount of mechanics. The more we tried to fix this idea, the more it looked like a beloved child that we have to mercy kill. It just doesn't work. We spent several hours trying to fix all issues, but for each new question there was no good answer. Eventually, we had to abandon it. So what do we do now? More ideas, even more ideas. Until Zahar said, screw shadow theater, a child who plays with shadows. It just clicked. It was 5 AM in the night at this point, and we finally had an idea we was happy with. A child who plays with toys on the floor and makes shadows on the wall. And then a child uses his imagination to play a 2D platformer level on these shadows. I went to bed and Zahar stayed up all night to find some references and define the style of the game. The next day I woke up to this, a document full of references and guidelines for the game made by Zahar, and a reference to this music video as an inspiration for art style. Cool, now I have some programming to do. I make the core mechanic of the game, and it's actually quite simple. To find the position of the shadow on the wall, I cast a straight line from light source through the object on the wall, and the size of the shadow comes from similar triangles and a simple proportion. The result works pretty well. I also make sure that the scaling function works in the editor to make level design and overall work easier. If you want to develop effectively, it's important to develop the development tools. While I was on it, Zahar did some level design, and at the end of the day, we had a working prototype with one level, so we tested it. I even asked my parents to help, and I carefully watched their playthrough and took notes on how much time it takes my mom to figure out each step. I was happy to see that pretty much without any gaming experience, they managed to complete the game without my help. So the game mechanics must be obvious and easy to understand. So it was going well until it didn't. In the evening, I once again looked at the levels that Zahar designed and I didn't like it. And this is when our workflow started to crumble again. The levels were too easy and in a very specific way. From the beginning, I wanted the game to be puzzle, which means that the player has to think to find the correct solution. In the levels designed by Zahar, you're faced with a problem in 2D, and the very first and obvious idea that comes to your mind is the correct solution. And this idea comes instinctively, without you thinking about it, especially once you've learned the rules of the game in the previous levels. You're also given enough freedom and more than enough toys in 3D to implement the solution, so finishing the level is not challenging at all. To put it into perspective, imagine that you're playing Portal, one of the best puzzle games, and you walk into the room and you see a bunch of buttons and an even bigger bunch of boxes. Your first immediate thought will be to place boxes on buttons, and that's it, level completed. A good way to think about puzzles is that you have a lot of things that you can do and a lot of combinations of these things, but only one option is the correct solution that you have to find. If every option works, or if there's only one viable option to try, then there are no wrong answers. At this point, it's the skill of your hands deciding how fast you beat the level, not your brain deciding whether or not you beat it at all. It's not a puzzle anymore, it's a sandbox with a narrative. There's also a different angle to look at this. Zahar often told me about the flow theory, which for me was just a fancy way to say not too easy, not too difficult. I mean, just look at the graph, that's literally it. But if you pay more attention, you'll see that difficulty is not the key. This right here is time. It can be denoted as skill, but skill must grow steadily, so the more you play the game, the more to the right you get on the graph. And since our game features real physics to drag the toys around, it's this long time that you have to spend unchallenged after you already know the solution that drags you into the boring zone. To solve this issue, I also expected to have a problem in 3D, based on the fact that our toys collide and can't be put in the same place, similar to how these sliding puzzles work. In this scenario, you're faced with a problem in 2D, but when you try to solve it, you create a problem in 3D, so when you then try to solve that, you create even more problems in 2D and circle back to the original problem. I was aiming for level design that forces the player to ping-pong between 2D and 3D several times and makes them pay attention to both. Now I wanna point out that these problems should not be difficult. It can be very easy, even trivial, but because the next task only reveals after you solve the previous one, it makes you think not once, but for the entire level. It's this succession of tasks that drags you out of the boring zone. It's this succession of tasks that creates the flow. Not increased difficulty, but regular tasks to fill in the gaps in time. When I presented these considerations to Zahar, he said, "It's impossible. 2D here, 3D there, it's too difficult. We are not able to design such levels in 5 dimensions, and players will not be able to solve it." Of course, I didn't agree and thought that it was possible, but even more importantly, that it was absolutely necessary for a good puzzle game. Now I gotta say that Zahar wasn't just boring or skeptical. He tried his best to make the game as cool as possible, but with regard to how much time, skill and resources we had, so his arguments are actually very reasonable. After some arguing, Zahar said, "Design a level that fits your requirements, then we'll talk." Alright, challenge accepted. One trick I like to use when designing a puzzle is to shove an obvious solution right in the player's hands, but when they try to use it, it doesn't work, so they need to think again and find a different, intended solution. It works especially well when you are trailing the obvious solution from previous levels, so a player is more tempted to use it again. And I actually know this method not from game design, but from one of my college teachers who used it to teach her subject. She often gave us a problem that looked very similar to a problem we just learned to solve, but when we applied the previous method, we got the wrong answer, and only after that the teacher revealed what the difference was and what the correct solution must be. And I think that a lot of games actually do that, not only puzzles but in general. Game designers force the player to make mistakes, and mistakes reinforce the experience. It makes you think in the process and not in the planning phase. It makes you find new ways to play, and it makes you strongly remember the reason you made a mistake and particularly appreciate the new solution around that. So I did exactly that, and after an hour of tinkering I made this. A level that has an obvious solution, but when you try to implement it, you find out that it requires placing toys inside of each other. So you have to think again and find a different approach. When I presented this design to Zahar, he said, "It doesn't work." It looks nice in theory, but it's too difficult to be in a real game. Of course, I didn't agree, and after some arguing, Zahar said, make this level in the game, then we'll talk. Challenge accepted. After an hour of tinkering, I made this. A level where the obvious solution doesn't work because the toys collide, just as I wanted. There was just one minor flaw. The intended solution also didn't work, and I completely overlooked it before I showed it to Zahar. Obviously, he said it doesn't work. But not only that, he said that this level not working is the proof of him being right, and that this kind of level design is too difficult to implement. Of course, I didn't agree, and I said that I can fix both this level and all the issues with level design at the same time. It was already late, so Zahar went to bed and I stayed up in the night to try to fix the game. And after hours of tinkering, warning! If you want to play the game, but you haven't yet, I really recommend you doing it now. What you're about to see may spoil your experience and break the illusion and immersion of the game. It's completely free, you can play it right in your browser, and it's quite short. You can complete it in about 15 minutes. You've been warned. So, before I fix the problem, I have to identify the problem. The intended solution doesn't work. Why? Because I can't make the shadow high enough for the intended solution. Why? Because the toy is too wide and bumps in the boundary of the playing area. Why? Because I had to make it so wide to block the other toy from being placed next to it to make the obvious solution not working. Why? Because when you derive the scale of the shadow from proportional triangles, you get a scaling function that looks like this. Notice how it's inconsistent with steep slope next to a light and a flat slope next to a wall. A toy can be placed anywhere in this area and it will still hit the required height for obvious solution. So I have to make toys very wide to block each other and to make the obvious solution not working. But the only place where the shadow is high enough for the intended solution is right next to the light, and now a toy can't get there because it's too wide and bumps into the boundary of a playing area. So the root of our problem is the core of the game. It's how shadows work. It's how reality works. And what do we do now? Do we change the reality? Exactly. After hours of tinkering, I made this. Now tell me, what do you see in this picture? A light, a toy, and a shadow on the wall, right? Wrong. This light is just for visual effect. The real point from which the shadow is calculated is back there, outside of the camera. This way, the playing area is less distorted and more parallel. That makes it easier to comprehend for player and easier to work with for level designer. The position of a shadow along axis X is still a straight line cast from light to wall, but only for X. The height of a shadow is a scale along axis Y, and it's constant outside of playing area. It's equal to 1 next to a wall, and it's equal to an arbitrary number that I made up, which is 4 next to a light. This way, when designing a stencil for the level, I know exactly what sizes the shadows are from the sizes of my hidden stencil toys. And in the playing area, the Y scale changes linearly from 1 to 4. But that's not it. Since the toys also have a non-zero width along axis Z, it bumps into the boundaries and can't reach its extreme values inside of playing area. So I shift and scale the scaling function for each toy individually based on its Z width, so it hits its extreme values of scale exactly on the boundaries. The width of the shadow is a scale along axis X and is calculated exactly the same way as the Y scale, except it changes in the range from 1 to 3 because I don't want a super wide shadow to cover the entire wall when it's next to the light. So yeah, X and Y change differently and the shape of the shadow actually changes as well. But that's not it. Since X scale stops changing next to the wall while X position continues to drag the shadows apart, it creates a gap between the toys that are close to a wall. So I multiply the entire X scale by 1.25 just to close that gap, and Y position of a shadow is calculated as if it was a scale of a different object under the toy. That way, when I move stencil toys along axis Y, it's consistent and there are no gaps between the shadows. Are you with me so far? This new scaling function works, but more importantly, it's still convincing. You probably wouldn't have noticed that something is wrong if I didn't tell you, even though the lines clearly don't align. And this proves that games don't need to be realistic. If it works, it works. The game was saved. At this point it was 4 AM in the night, so I called it a day. As you can see, this is not going according to plan. It is day 3 and all we have is a playable prototype with 2 levels, so we better keep going. I continued my work with code and editor, and Zahar started working on the graphics. And having a dedicated person to make a big part of the game was a new experience for me as well. I'm just sitting there, minding my business, make a git pull every now and then, and just by magic, all these amazing assets appear in my project folder. This was a game changer, because you know we are making a game and there's now new content in the game, so the game is now different, so the game has changed. Anyways, since we were going for this shaky, wiggly, sketchy art style, Zahar had to draw each picture 4 times. Then I put it in a script that changes the sprite several times a second, and boom, sketchy style. We also wanted to create that feeling that you don't just move objects in the shadow world, but create these levels by combining shadows. So I asked Zahar to draw the contour and the fill separately, and masked out the contour inside of the box to create the illusion of a big continuous object. It's not perfect, but I think it's a nice touch and in a good direction. Overall, Zahar made art for the character, objects, background, and also nice animated transitions. Oh yeah, the transition. The transition was very important to get right, as it's the central element and really the face of the game. We put this and this into one game, and we have to convince the player that it's all one thing, one big story. The transition has to establish this connection between the two worlds. And it also has to be exciting. The very first transition in the first level is supposed to be the biggest wow moment of the entire game. So I spent quite some time getting the timing of the camera movement just right. Oh yeah, the camera. In this scene, the camera angle alone took me several hours to find. Initially, I tried to mimic what a child would see if they sat on the floor and played, but from this angle, the toys that are placed far obscure each other and it's hard to see what's going on. So I moved the camera up in the air and made it less perspective and more orthographic. But then the 2D world becomes too skewed, so I had to go back and find a sweet spot in the middle. Then, if you make the camera straight, the 2D and 3D worlds are placed on top of each other and occupy very little space on a horizontal 16:9 monitor, but if you rotate the camera too much, the playing area becomes diagonal, and it's a pain to both understand what's going on and to drag the mouse in diagonal lines to match the place or size of the shadow. And finally, when the angle felt just perfect, there was still a lot of blank space left on the sides of the screen, so we added a storage area where you can place toys to, but cannot cast shadows from, and also justified the empty space with the massive dream button. We also added the tutorial, and we made it as small as possible. I compressed the entire tutorial to just 2 lines of text, and I achieved it by referring to things that people already know, like drag and mouse in the same sentence immediately brings up the drag and drop mechanic that the player probably knows how to use. And we made this text without the wiggling effect to make it not stressful to read and easy to understand. We were working fast and we had big plans for the game. We wanted to add more game mechanics, like toys that you can stack on top of each other and transparent objects that don't cast shadows. We wanted to make different characters for each level, like a knight in A Dream About Towers and a miner in A Dream About Caves. And we wanted to make a continuous story through the levels, like a fantasy that grows in a child's mind for many days. But it didn't happen. Suddenly it was 3 AM in the night and we had to call it a day. By the way, I do not recommend you to get sleep deprived, and Mark Brown also doesn't recommend. Yes, I went to sleep late, but I also woke up late to compensate, so on average I slept for about 7 hours a day during the jam. And you should too. Your brain needs sleep to be effective, and more importantly, there are a lot of game jams, but there's only one you to take care of. Please take care. As you can see, this is still not going according to plan. It is day 4 and all we have is a playable prototype with 2 levels. Yes, still a prototype, because there's still no sound. Zahar found some free music and we both found some free assets for the most basic sound effects. Sound design didn't need to be too detailed, but we tried to make it responsive to players' actions, which provides a more immersive experience. Level design was still a massive task, even with new non-realistic linear scaling functions. There was no way we could design and develop many levels in the remaining hours, so we went for a bare minimum, just a couple more levels to properly introduce all game mechanics and to link the levels in a somewhat steady difficulty slope. Another part of the game we didn't do ourselves, along with the music, was free low-poly 3D models. A surprising amount of 3D models. Just look at this long list. All of this is required for a tiny video game with just 4 levels that looks like this. It's so easy to underestimate the amount of work in game development. I think that if we had a dedicated person just to make 3D models, they would barely catch up with the amount and quality we needed in just 4 days. And I'm saying it with some confidence. I have experience in 3D modeling, and I even made a gem game earlier with all 3D modeling and animations done by me. And that's exactly why it looked so empty in the end. After the levels were done, we had only several hours left before the deadline, so we had to cut it and to start the polishing. We locked the game in its state, so there was no more content to be added to make sure that we don't break something accidentally. Whatever levels, mechanics and art the game had at the moment was final. All we could do is test the game and fix all the issues and bugs we could find. At this point, it's important to prioritize. There is no time to fix everything, but some fixes give a greater impact to the quality and playability of the game, while others might require huge effort to implement. You can plot all things you can do on a graph of what's needed to be done and what can easily be done, and focus on that corner to achieve the highest quality in the lowest possible time. Zahar decided to make character walking animations, as he assumed that it's crucial for the game feel, and I decided to fix several movement bugs we discovered that allowed the players to soft lock or to skip puzzles in unintended ways. I found it being very important in a game with unique mechanics, because the players don't know how the game is supposed to work, and if they get stuck, they wouldn't know about it, and instead of restarting the level to try again, they will just stand there in frustration, thinking it's their fault and looking for a solution that don't exist. The opposite is also bad. If a player accidentally completes a level in an unintended way, they would think that it was just that easy and wouldn't learn anything from it. It's especially important to fix in a short gem game of just 4 levels, because if you skip even one level, it would spoil a big portion of a game experience. Also, I proposed the title for the game My Shadows Are Bright to show how a child can find bright and fun fantasies in stereotypically dark and scary shadows. As the deadline became closer and closer, we asymptotically converged to it by choosing the most important among smaller and smaller tasks, until finally I pressed the save button one last time. The game was done, and we liked it. It had unique game mechanics and a strong connection to the theme, it had bright cozy visuals like Zahar wanted, and it had deep puzzle level design as I wanted. But for us, this game was also something different. Just look at this. Just listen to this. It's so nostalgic, so melancholic. And fun fact, me and Zahar are friends since we were 2 years old, and after all those years, out of nothing, we unite once again and make this. What a story to be told. But just because I think the game is special, doesn't mean everyone thinks so. Let's see what other people say. Overall, the feedback was quite positive. People liked interesting game mechanics and cozy art style. Some people even streamed our game, and I couldn't miss an opportunity to watch them playtesting it live. I was happy to see our game design hypothesis working in real life. Streamers easily understood the rules of the game, they were amazed with the first transition to the dream world, they went for all the traps I left for them in my puzzle design, and they caught the vibe of childhood joy we went for. Another interesting thing is that there were very few complaints about the game, which is strange given how little time we spent polishing it. One person specifically mentioned exactly that, how hard it was for them to point out the negatives compared to other games. One reason may be that the game is quite unusual, so it's hard to compare it against something else. I think that we also did a good job of planning ahead and avoided a lot of problems by not creating them in the first place. But the most important thing must be good prioritizing and choosing to fix the most significant issues first. For example, this shadow is just a default Unity cube which I made thin and dark grey. It looks kinda ugly, and there's even Z-fighting visual bug happening from time to time. Replacing this cube with a proper texture with soft edges was very high on my priority list for the entire development. But each time I told Zahar that I'm about to do it, he told that there are more important things to do, so I listened to him and never fixed the shadows in the end. You know how many people complained about it? Zero! Not a single person mentioned shadow textures in their feedback. Turns out it was a correct decision all along to focus on different things instead. Anyways, I think it's time for the results. Let's fast forward 1 week and see how feedback converts to numbers. I could not believe this. 37th place in public rating. I never even got top 1000, and Zahar never got anything at all. It's his first jam ever. Out of 7000 participants, we got top 0.5%. It was insane. And we also got top 100, which means that now Mark Brown himself will play our game and decide whether or not it deserves to be in his official 20 favorites. Let's fast forward 1 more week and see the final result.
Alright, let me show you My Shadows Are Bright.
We did it. We won GMTK Game Jam 2024. Now I don't wanna argue which game is better and which is not. I think that everyone who submitted a game did a fantastic job. I played quite some games this jam and there were no unplayable ones. Every game was at least interesting in the concept and had a lot of effort put into it. I genuinely enjoyed my time playing all of these games. And of course all of 20 Mark's favorite games are amazing. For me personally, getting top 20 must be the biggest achievement of my entire life. So far, there will be more, just wait for it. So apparently our game is great. Go play it now. I hope you already did. It's completely free, it got a pod jam update with lots of minor improvements, and you can play it right in your browser. And you can also follow me and subscribe to my channels. if you want. Conclusion. What did we learn? 1. The game was not destined to win once we got the idea. We had to work real hard to make the idea even viable, let alone winning. 2. Priority assessment is crucial. We didn't fix everything about the game, but trust me, you don't wanna know what the game would have looked like if we chose to fix different things instead. 3. Games don't need to be realistic. If it works, it works. And humans are not very good at spotting inconsistencies, which can be used for a good cause. And 4. Team matters. It's important to find awesome people, but it's just as important to communicate, to explain and understand. And it's important to trust, to let your teammate take responsibility and do a thing that you sometimes even disagree with. And it's important to not worry about it and to spend your precious time doing something else. Huge thanks to Zahar for literally creating half of the game I'm talking about. Thanks to each and everyone who participated in this jam, who made games, who played and rated games, who was giving feedback and was just hanging around. Thanks to the team behind itch.io and to people behind the GMTK YouTube channel and GMTK Discord server. And special mega thanks to Mark Brown for organizing such an amazing event. I'll see you all next year. Have a nice everything, bye!